The crystal shatters, and the air in the Dellucci's private dining room turns to ice. As a terrified busboy waits for the lethal judgment of Narciso Dellucci, a modest waitress leans in, not to plead for his life, but to whisper a single phrase in a forgotten, ancient Sicilian dialect into the ear of the family's matriarch. In a room where tradition is law, her voice doesn't just break the silence, it commands it. In that moment, the invisible server reveals she carries the weight of a bloodline that could rewrite the history of Chicago's underworld. At the Fontana Club, an elite sanctuary of power and ancient secrets, the staff has one rule: be a ghost. For Jamie J. Miraglia, this is more than a job, it's a survival tactic. By day, she is a face in the crowd, a modest server hiding a heritage that her family fled decades ago to escape a bloody past. But during a high-stakes summit, the fragile peace is broken. A glass of wine spills across the dress of Clara Fontana, the elegant and feared symbol of Dellucci tradition. Narciso Dellucci, a man of calm, watchful authority, slowly rises, his silence more terrifying than a shout. The room waits for the strike. Then, Jamie does the impossible. She steps into the circle of power and whispers directly to Clara in a rhythmic, ancient Sicilian tongue used only by the island's founding elite. The violence freezes. Clara's eyes widen in shock and recognition. Narciso's gaze shifts, sharp and suspicious, toward the woman he had dismissed as a common servant. With that one whisper, Jamie's life of hiding is over. She has used the code of her ancestors to save a life, and in doing so, she has become the one thing more dangerous than an enemy, a waitress with the insider status to topple an empire. The onyx room breathed with a heavy, predatory luxury, but Jamie J. Miraglia moved through its velvet-lined shadows like a ghost. At 26, she had perfected the art of the unremarked presence. She wore her uniform, a stiff, black apron and a high-collared white shirt, as a suit of armor, designed to flatten her identity until she was nothing more than a vessel for carrying crystal flutes of vintage Franciacorta. Her hair was scraped back into a bun so tight it felt like a physical constraint, a reminder to keep her expressions neutral and her eyes cast toward the polished mahogany floors. In the hierarchy of the Fontana Club, Jamie was part of the background noise, as vital and as overlooked as the air filtration system. She spent her shifts navigating the currents of cigar smoke and whispered conspiracies, her ears picking up the cadence of power while her face remained a mask of subservience. She knew which captains preferred their espresso with a single twist of lemon and which young soldiers were likely to let their tempers flare over a bad hand of cards. She watched it all, recording every tremor of tension in the room, but she never let the light of intelligence hit her eyes. To be seen was to be questioned, and to be questioned was to risk the delicate, quiet life she had built. When the clock finally struck 3:00 a.m., Jamie stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, the smell of expensive tobacco clinging to her skin. She walked 3 blocks to her cramped apartment in a building that smelled of old brick and damp laundry. It was a place of beige walls and functional furniture, a secondary layer of invisibility. But in the corner of her bedroom, tucked beneath a stack of second-hand blankets, sat a heavy trunk made of dark, iron-bound cedar. Each night, before sleep claimed her, Jamie would kneel before it. The key hung on a thin silver chain around her neck, tucked beneath her shirt. As the lid creaked open, the scent of dried orange blossoms and ancient dust filled the room, the smell of a Sicily that no longer existed. Inside lay the fragments of a stolen legacy. A hand-woven lace shawl that had belonged to a duchess, a set of silver coins minted during a forgotten reign, and a leather-bound ledger filled with the rhythmic, archaic script of her ancestors. These were the heirlooms of the Miraglia line, a family that had once held the keys to the island's most sacred traditions. They were the secrets she carried in her marrow, the reason her tongue naturally curled into the sharp, melodic vowels of a dialect that the modern world had abandoned. She traced the frayed edges of the lace, her fingers memorizing the patterns of a heritage she was forbidden to claim in the light of day. In the silence of her room, she wasn't just a waitress with a debt, she was the keeper of a dying flame. She locked the trunk, the click of the mechanism sounding like a final warning. Tomorrow, she would put on the apron again. She would be invisible. She would be safe. But as she closed her eyes, the ancient words of her grandfather echoed in her mind, a restless tide waiting for the moment to break the shore. The following Thursday, the air in the Fontana Club carried a specific, metallic charge. It was the scent of impending judgment. The regular patrons had been cleared out by 7 p.m., replaced by a phalanx of men in tailored charcoal suits who stood like statues against the gold-leafed pillars. Jamie felt the vibration of the heavy street doors opening before she heard them. Narciso Dellucci entered first. He didn't walk so much as claim the space he moved through. He was a man of quiet, terrifying stillness, his black suit absorbing the light of the chandeliers. Behind him, draped in silk the color of a bruised plum, was Clara Fontana. She moved with a regal, measured pace, her silver hair styled in a sharp wave that mirrored the cold precision of her gaze. The staff had been briefed for days, but the atmosphere was so thick with tension that even the most seasoned servers fumbled. Jamie was assigned to the periphery, her task to ensure the side tables remained immaculate. She watched as Thomas, a 19-year-old busboy with jittery hands and a heart too big for this underworld, approached the main table to refresh the sparkling water. The table was a landscape of high stakes. A single handgun rested casually near Narciso's elbow, a silent reminder of the price of failure. Thomas reached for the lead crystal decanter, but his eyes drifted for a fraction of a second toward Narciso's watchful face. That flicker of fear was his undoing. The base of the decanter caught the edge of a silver charger, tilting sharply. The deep, ruby-red Barolo didn't just spill, it erupted. A fan of dark liquid sprayed across the white linen, drenching the sleeve of Clara's silk dress and splattering the pristine cuff of Narciso's shirt. The sound of the wine hitting the table was as loud as a gunshot in the sudden, vacuum-like silence. Thomas froze, his face draining of color until he looked like a marble bust. The decanter slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor, a jagged crystalline punctuation mark to his mistake. Narciso didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. He simply looked down at the red stain spreading across his cuff, then slowly, agonizingly, turned his gaze toward Thomas. It was the look of a predator deciding where to make the first cut. Two of the men by the door stepped forward, their hands moving with practiced fluidity toward the shadows of their jackets. Clara's hand, adorned with a ring bearing the ancient Fontana crest, trembled slightly on the table. It wasn't tremor of fear, but of insulted dignity. A breach of the old world order that demanded a blood sacrifice to restore. Jamie, standing 10 feet away, saw the life flash out of Thomas's eyes. She saw the wolf prepare to move. The invisibility she had cultivated for years, the safety of the shadows she had prayed for, suddenly felt like a shroud. She knew the protocol, stay silent and you live. But as Narciso's hand reached for the heavy glass ashtray, his knuckles widening, Jamie felt the trunk in her bedroom. The weight of the old lace, the ancient coins, and the rhythmic, forgotten dialect, pulse in her mind. The ghost of her grandfather whispered that some debts were paid in wine, and others in silence. She realized then that if she stayed a ghost, Thomas would become one, too. Stepping out of the darkness, she moved toward the eye of the storm. Jamie didn't think, she moved. The distance between the shadows of the peripheral service station and the center of the Dellucci table felt like a mile, but she crossed it with a fluid, haunting grace that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. The men in charcoal suits tensed, their hands twitching toward their holsters, but Narciso Dellucci didn't signal them to stop her. He merely narrowed his eyes, his hand still hovering over the heavy glass ashtray, as this slip of a girl stepped into the light. She didn't look at Narciso. She didn't look at the sobbing busboy. She leaned down, her modest server's apron brushing against the velvet chair, and placed her lips inches from Clara Fontana's ear. The words Jamie spoke were not the harsh, guttural Italian heard in the streets of Chicago or the rhythmic Neapolitan of the docks. They were melodic, sharp, and carried an ancient, coastal saltiness. It was the old Sicilian of the latifundia. A dialect of the landowning elite, a code of honor and blood that had been considered extinct for nearly a century. Apazia di un caruso non merita u sangu di un regnu, matri, she whispered, her voice a low, steady vibration. U venu si lava, ma u disanuri di una fisa non netta resta pi sempre. Clara Fontana froze. The hand that had been trembling with indignation suddenly went skeletal and still. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the wine stain with murderous intent, snapped toward Jamie's face. The shock that registered there was so profound it was physical. The matriarch's breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, the Iron Mother of the Dellucci Empire looked like a frightened child. The power in the room shifted with the weight of a falling mountain. Narciso's hand lowered. He sensed it immediately, the sudden, violent change in his mother's internal weather. He looked from his mother's pale face to the waitress who had dared to touch her, his expression shifting from predatory boredom to a razor-sharp, lethal curiosity. "What did you say to her?" Narciso's voice was a low-frequency growl that made the crystal on the table hum. Jamie stood up straight, her hands clasped behind her back in the standard position of service. The trembling had left her. She looked Narciso directly in the eye, a breach of protocol that should have cost her everything, but she was no longer a waitress. She was a mirror. "I told her that the wine is a trifle of the earth," Jamie replied in English, though her accent had shifted, carrying the ghost of that ancient, regal lilt. But to spill blood over a clumsy child's accident is to admit that the Dellucci legacy is as fragile as the glass on the floor. A true queen of the island does not notice the dirt on her sleeve, she only notices the loyalty in the room. Clara Fontana finally spoke, her voice barely a rasp. Where did you learn that tongue, Pixarita?" "That is the speech of the golden shell. My grandfather was the last man I heard speak those words before he was buried in the hills of Palermo." Jamie didn't blink. "It is the language of those who remember who they are, Signora. I have never forgotten." The gunmen by the door looked at one another, confused, their weapons still hidden but their authority evaporated. The busboy, Thomas, sensing the shift, crawled backward into the shadows, forgotten. Narciso didn't look at the boy. He leaned back in his chair, his watchful eyes tracing the lines of Jamie's face as if reading a map. The invisible girl was gone, and in her place stood a mystery that threatened to be more dangerous than any rival's bullet. The transition from the dining room to Narciso's private office felt like being led into the belly of a sleeping predator. The air here was different, thicker, scented with heavy cedar, expensive scotch, and the metallic tang of oiled machinery. Narciso walked toward a massive desk of dark, scarred oak, his movements as silent as a shadow on a tombstone. He didn't offer Jamie a seat. He simply stood behind the desk, the low light of a green-shaded lamp casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to make the guilty crumble and the innocent scream. Jamie remained standing in the center of the Persian rug, her hands still clasped behind her back. She didn't fidget. She didn't look at the walls lined with leather-bound books or the heavy bronze scales on the mantel. She kept her gaze fixed on the space just above Narciso's tie, maintaining the invisible posture even as the ground beneath her shifted. "My mother is a woman of iron," Narciso said finally, his voice a low, rhythmic purr that vibrated in the small room. "She hasn't been shocked by a man in 30 years. And yet, tonight, a waitress with wine on her hands turned her to stone with a single sentence." He leaned forward, the light catching the sharp, predatory curve of his jaw. "That dialect you spoke, that isn't something you learn from a Rosetta Stone or a university lecture. That is the language of the Palazzi. It is the language of families who died out or were wiped out before I was born." He opened a humidor, the scent of tobacco filling the space, but he didn't light a cigar. He just turned it in his fingers, watching her. Tell me, Jamie J. Miraglia, if that is even your name. How does a server at the Fontana Club speak the tongue of the Sicilian founding lords? And why is it that when I look at you now, I no longer see a waitress, but a woman hiding a crown in her apron? Jamie felt the silver chain around her neck, the cold weight of the trunk key pressing against her skin like a brand. The lion's den was not just the office, it was the gravity of his attention. She knew that a lie would be her ending, but the full truth was a different kind of death. My name is my own, Mr. Dellucci, she said, her voice steady, carrying the quiet authority she had revealed at the table. And the language, it was the only thing my grandfather had left to give me. He told me that words are the only wealth the sea cannot swallow and the fires cannot burn. He taught me that in Sicily, your tongue tells people who you are long before your actions do. Narciso stepped around the desk, moving into her personal space. He was close enough that she could smell the faint, sharp scent of his cologne, something like sandalwood and cold rain. Your grandfather was a man of the old world, then. A man who knew that secrets are the only real currency. He reached out, his fingers stopping just short of her chin. You saved a boy's life tonight, but you traded your safety for his. You aren't a ghost anymore, Jamie. You're a focal point. And in my world, things that stand out either get polished or they get broken. He turned away, walking toward the window that overlooked the rain-slicked streets of Chicago. You will not return to the floor. From tomorrow, you report to my mother's estate. She wants to know the rest of the sentences your grandfather taught you. And I? He paused, his reflection in the glass looking back at her with a lethal, shimmering interest. I want to see what else you are hiding in those shadows. The transition from the smoky corners of the Fontana Club to the limestone walls of the Dellucci estate was like moving from a battlefield to a fortress. Jamie no longer wore the heavy canvas apron of a waitress. Instead, she was dressed in a simple, charcoal gray sheath dress that felt like a second skin, though the silver chain and the antique key still remained hidden against her chest. She stood in a sun-drenched conservatory that smelled of lemon trees and old stone, positioned exactly 3 steps behind Clara Fontana's shoulder. Across from them sat 3 men who looked as though they had been carved from the very obsidian of Mount Etna. These were the Old Country Associates, delegates from the Palermo families who viewed the American wing of the syndicate with a mixture of greed and quiet disdain. They spoke a rapid, thick Italian, but underneath the surface, they traded barbs in a coded slang designed to exclude anyone not born within their specific zip code. Narciso sat at the head of the marble table, his expression unreadable, his hands folded with a stillness that Jamie now knew was his most dangerous state. The lead associate, a man named Don Calogero with skin like crumpled parchment, leaned forward. He spoke in standard Italian about shipping routes and percentages, but then, with a smirk directed at his companions, he switched to a low, guttural mutter in a regional dialect. The young wolf thinks he can lead with a silver spoon, Calogero murmured to his associates, his eyes flicking toward Narciso. He doesn't realize we've already redirected the flow at the source. He's buying empty crates while we fill our own cellars. The other men chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Narciso remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ledger in front of him. He didn't know the dialect. He was being outplayed in his own house by men who thought his modern sensibilities made him deaf. Clara Fontana shifted slightly, her rings catching the light. She didn't look at Jamie, but the tension in her posture was an unspoken command. Jamie stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room like a cool breeze over a scorched field. The young wolf has a long memory, Don Calogero, Jamie said, speaking not in their guttural slang, but in that same high, aristocratic Sicilian that had stopped the room nights before. And he knows that a cellar filled with stolen goods is easily burned if the foundation is built on a lie. The silence that followed was absolute. Calogero's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. To hear that specific, noble dialect coming from a girl who looked like a secretary was like hearing a ghost recount your own sins. It wasn't just that she understood them, it was that her very tone carried the authority of the families who had once ruled over theirs. Jamie didn't stop. She turned her gaze to Narciso, translating the insult and the betrayal with surgical precision, stripping away their coded protections until the treachery lay bare on the marble table. Narciso didn't move a muscle, but his eyes flared with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. He looked at Calogero, then slowly at Jamie. The test was over. He had suspected she was a weapon, but he hadn't realized she was a master key, one that could unlock the secrets of a world he had been trying to conquer for a lifetime. Calogero began to stammer an excuse, but Clara Fontana simply raised a hand. "You came here thinking we were deaf," she said, her voice like cracking ice. "But it seems we have the only voice that matters." As the guards moved in to escort the panicked associates out, Narciso caught Jamie's eye. For the first time, there was no suspicion in his look, only the terrifying realization that they were now inextricably linked by a language of blood. The following Sunday, the Dellucci estate played host to a peace dinner that felt more like a wake. The guests were the remaining heads of the local territories, men who had seen their influence erode under Narciso's calculated expansion. They gathered in the formal dining hall, a room dominated by a table of Carrara marble and a chandelier that cast jagged, diamond-like shadows across their faces. Jamie stood once more in her place of newfound shadow, positioned behind Clara Fontana. Her role was no longer to serve the wine, but to observe the ritual. In the old country tradition, a meal was a sacred contract. To break bread was to swear an oath of non-aggression, a custom so ancient that even the most modern gangster felt the weight of its history. The center of the table held a large, rustic loaf of crusty bread and a small, silver cellar filled with coarse sea salt. Narciso sat at the head, his eyes hooded, his movements economical. He watched as the men tore pieces of the bread, dipping them into the salt before eating, a public declaration of their shared bond. "We are brothers under this roof," announced Silvio, a territory boss whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "The past is buried, Narciso. We accept the new terms." Narciso nodded slowly, reaching for the salt cellar to finalize the pact. But Jamie's eyes were not on Narciso. They were on Silvio's hands. She noticed the way his thumb had lingered on the edge of the silver vessel, and the way he had tilted it almost imperceptibly toward the left. As Narciso's hand hovered over the salt, Jamie stepped forward. The movement was so sudden it caused the guards to shift, their leather holsters creaking in the silence. "Stop," Jamie said, her voice a low, melodic chime that carried the unmistakable weight of the Latifondia dialect. Narciso's hand froze. He didn't look at Silvio, he looked at Jamie. "Explain," he commanded. Jamie walked to the table, her eyes fixed on the silver cellar. "In the hills of my grandfather's home, there is a way to say, 'I hate you,' without speaking a word. It is called the tradimento del sale, the betrayal in the salt." She pointed to the silver vessel. "Silvio has spilled a fine line of salt across the rim, pointing toward the door. In the old code, it means the bread is hollow. He is telling his men that the oath is void the moment he leaves this room." A deafening silence descended. The other bosses looked at the salt, then at Silvio, whose face had turned the color of ash. They had missed it. Narciso's modern security team, trained in ballistics and surveillance, had missed it. But Jamie, raised on the superstitions and secret symbols of a forgotten world, had seen the declaration of war hidden in plain sight. Narciso leaned forward, his gaze now a lethal laser fixed on Silvio. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he reached for the salt cellar and slowly, deliberately, wiped the rim clean with his thumb. "It seems," Narciso whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, newfound respect as he glanced at Jamie, "that my guests have forgotten their manners. And it seems I have found the only person in Chicago who knows how to read the truth." Clara Fontana let out a slow, satisfied breath, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. The dinner was over, but the power shift was just beginning. Jamie had not just spotted a sign of disrespect, she had proven that in a world of high-tech violence, the oldest secrets were still the deadliest. In the days following the dinner of the broken salt, the atmosphere of the estate shifted from a fortress of suspicion to a sanctuary of tutelage. Jamie found herself summoned not to the kitchens or the offices, but to Clara Fontana's private solarium, a room draped in heavy silks where the air was thick with the scent of dried jasmine and old paper. The matriarch sat by a window that overlooked the gray, churning expanse of Lake Michigan, her hands, usually so still, busy sorting through a collection of yellowed photographs and wax-sealed envelopes. Clara gestured for Jamie to sit, an invitation that carried the weight of a royal decree. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant crash of the waves. "You have the eyes of a hawk and the tongue of a queen, Jamie," Clara said, her voice softer than it had been in the dining hall, though no less commanding. "But you carry your history like a burden you hope no one will see. You think you are hiding a shame, but you are actually hiding a crown." Clara reached into a small velvet box and pulled out a heavy gold locket, its surface etched with a design that made Jamie's heart stop. It was the same crest Jamie had seen on the silver coins in her trunk, a phoenix rising from a bed of orange blossoms. "My grandfather did not just speak your dialect," Clara continued, her gaze piercing Jamie's. "He served the family that perfected it. The Miraglias were not just founding lords. They were the keepers of the Great Code, the family that mediated between the warring factions of the island for 300 years. When your grandfather disappeared during the purges, it was said the heart of Sicily had stopped beating." Jamie felt the silver key against her chest grow warm, a phantom heat that seemed to pulse with the revelation. "We were told we were refugees," Jamie whispered, the English words feeling thin compared to the weight of the history. "My mother told me we fled because we were nothing." "You fled because you were everything," Clara corrected, her fingers brushing the locket. "The Miraglia bloodline is the only thing that can legitimize a rule in the eyes of the old world. To the families in Palermo, you aren't a waitress. You are a living claim. You are the only person who can bridge the gap between Narciso's new empire and the traditions that still govern the men who want to kill him." Clara leaned forward, taking Jamie's hand in her own. Her skin felt like parchment, but her grip was iron. "Narciso is a wolf, but even a wolf needs a North Star. I am old, Jamie. My strength is a shadow of what it was. I am giving you my blessing, not to be a servant, but to be the architect of this family's future. But you must understand, this blessing is a target. Once the world knows who you are, they will either kneel to you or try to extinguish you." Jamie looked out at the lake, the horizon blurred by a gathering storm. The invisibility she had craved for years now felt like a discarded skin. She realized that the trunk in her bedroom was no longer a secret stash of memories, it was an armory. As she looked back at Clara, she saw a reflection of the woman she was destined to become, a woman who used tradition as a blade. "I am ready to stop hiding," Jamie said, her voice echoing the melodic, aristocratic lilt of her ancestors. Clara smiled, a slow, dangerous expression of triumph. "Then let us show the wolf how to truly lead." The rumors of the waitress with the ancient tongue had spread through the Chicago winter like a fever, reaching the ears of those who viewed Narciso's sudden reliance on tradition as a vulnerability. The Moretti family, a younger, hungrier faction that cared nothing for the old codes, saw in Jamie a way to bypass the Dellucci steel. They didn't see a queen, they saw a hostage. The trap was sprung during an uncharacteristic moment of exposure. A quick trip to the city's archives where Jamie was researching the lost Miraglia deeds. As she stepped out into the rain-slicked alleyway, the air was suddenly choked with the smell of cheap exhaust and stale grease. 2 black SUVs cut off the exits, and 4 men, their faces obscured by the shadows of their brims, stepped into the light. These were not the men of the latifundia. They were mercenaries who held no respect for the betrayal in the salt. "The boss wants a word, princess," the lead gunman sneered, gesturing toward the open door of the vehicle. "He thinks you know some secrets that might help us balance the books." Jamie felt the familiar weight of the silver key against her chest, but she didn't panic. Her mind, sharpened by years of hiding and days of Clara's tutelage, shifted into the cold, strategic focus of the Sicilian defense. She realized that if she screamed, she would be dead before Narciso's men arrived. She had to use their own arrogance against them. "You are making a mistake that will cost you your lineage," Jamie said, her voice dropping into that melodic, terrifyingly calm lilt. She didn't look at the gun, she looked at the lead man's wrist, where a tattoo of a stylized viper peeked out from his cuff. "The Moretti family is already crumbling. You are here because you are desperate, and desperate men are easy to read." She stepped forward, not away. The movement was so counterintuitive that the gunman hesitated. "You think I am the weakness," she continued, her eyes flashing with a lethal, aristocratic fire. "But I am the one who knows which of your brothers has already sold your coordinates to the Delluccis. Why do you think the streetlights on this block just went dark?" As if on cue, the flickering overhead lamp buzzed and died, plunging the alley into total darkness. It was a calculated gamble. She had noticed the faulty wiring upon her arrival, but in their heightened state of nerves, it felt like a supernatural confirmation of her power. The men shifted, their eyes darting to the rooftops, their confidence evaporating. Jamie didn't run. She used the momentary confusion to reach into her bag and pull out the heavy, iron-bound ledger she had been studying. She slammed it against the side of the metal dumpster, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. "The wolf is already behind you," she commanded in the old tongue. The gunman, terrified of the invisible authority she projected, scrambled. One fired a blind shot into the brickwork, but the sound of distant sirens, triggered by Jamie's quiet SOS on her hidden transmitter minutes earlier, broke their resolve. They piled back into the SUVs, tires screeching as they fled the cursed girl who spoke like a ghost. When Narciso's black sedan roared into the alley moments later, he found Jamie standing perfectly still, her charcoal coat damp with rain, her expression as unreadable as the marble in his dining hall. He vaulted from the car, his face a mask of rare, uncontrolled fear. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders. "I am fine, Narciso," Jamie said, the ancient lilt still vibrating in her voice. They thought they were hunting a waitress. They didn't realize they were walking into a fortress. Narciso looked at the scorched brick where the bullet had struck, then back at Jamie. The realization hit him then, she wasn't just an advisor. She was the most dangerous weapon he had ever possessed. He didn't just respect her, he was starting to fear what she would become. The Fontana Club was bathed in a different kind of light on the night the new order was finalized. The heavy, suffocating tension that had once defined the room had been replaced by a crystalline, absolute clarity. There were no guns resting on the tables tonight, and no terrified whispers in the corners. The city's elite, men who had once looked through Jamie as if she were made of glass, now stood in a rigid, unified silence as the heavy oak doors swung open. Jamie walked beside Narciso, her hand resting lightly on his forearm. She no longer wore the oversized white shirt or the stiff black apron of the invisible girl. She was draped in a floor-length gown of midnight silk, its deep luster echoing the ancient Mediterranean, and around her neck, the silver chain had been replaced by a heavy collar of white gold and diamonds that held the Miraglia phoenix. The transformation was complete, the server had become the sovereign. They reached the center of the room, stopping at the very table where the wine had once spilled and the world had fractured. Clara Fontana sat at the head, her silver hair catching the light like a halo of steel. Beside her sat the busboy, Thomas, no longer trembling but dressed in a sharp suit, his eyes bright with the safety Jamie had bought for him. Narciso surveyed the room, his watchful eyes no longer hunting for threats, but acknowledging peers. He turned to Jamie, his expression softening into something that bordered on reverence. He didn't just see a partner, he saw the soul of his empire. The city believes we lead through fear, Narciso said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. But fear is a fleeting currency. We lead through the code. We lead because we remember the words that everyone else forgot. He raised a crystal glass of Barolo, the same vintage that had once sparked a death sentence. And looked at Jamie. To the queen of the island. The woman who saw a wolf and decided to show him how to rule. Jamie took her own glass, her fingers steady, her gaze meeting his with the unyielding fire of her ancestors. She didn't look at the wine, she looked at the faces of the men who had once lived by violence alone and saw that they were now bound by the ancient laws she had resurrected. The betrayal in the salt was a memory, the whispered code was now the law of the land. A kingdom is only as strong as its memory, Jamie replied, her voice carrying the melodic, aristocratic lilt that had become the heartbeat of the city. We are no longer shadows in the dark. We are the light that defines it. The room erupted into a rhythmic, respectful applause, the sound of an underworld bowing to a new era. As the music began to play, a haunting Sicilian melody that Jamie's grandfather had hummed in the dark, she leaned into Narciso. They weren't just the king and queen of Chicago, they were the architects of a legacy that would outlast the skyscrapers and the blood. Jamie J. Miraglia, the waitress who had mastered the art of being invisible, finally allowed herself to be seen. And in her eyes, the phoenix didn't just rise, it soared. Checkmate.